Hello, welcome back to History Home Learning, and today is very exciting. We are going to finally talk about Jack the Ripper. And a couple of months ago I read a really good book about the victims of Jack the Ripper. It's called The Five. I've got my notes in here to talk to you guys about it. And this challenges the idea that all the women killed by Jack the Ripper were prostitutes. They were by no means prostitutes. 2 of them were prostitutes. The others were not. And that's a really interesting myth, because for years I was teaching the current year 10 last year, telling them they were all prostitutes, and it just wasn't true. So it's really interesting. You think you know something and then you expand your reading, find out more things, you have to change the way you teach. Very interesting to me anyway. So I'm just going to chat to you a little bit about the 5 women who were killed by Jack the Ripper, what they were doing and what happened to them. Okay? So I'm going to refer to my notes a little bit from my book. Okay, so there were 5 women killed. First one was Mary Ann Nichols, and she was also known by her friends as Polly. And then there was Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly. So the first one, we're going to call her Polly. That's what this book refers to her as, Polly Nichols. So she was actually very well educated. She could read and write, which not many people could in those days. And she moved into the Peabody estate. Remember, we looked at the Peabody estate with the new kind of council housing, and we know you had to be you had to have references, you had to be very respectable people. They wouldn't have let a prostitute live there. Okay, so Polly and her family, her husband and her children, moved into the Peabody estate. This is where it goes a little bit wrong for Polly, unfortunately. Her husband took a fancy to the next door neighbour in the Peabody estate and ended up, she left him because he was having an affair with this woman. And by this point, Polly's alcoholism had got quite bad. So that was obviously causing strain on their relationship, and then they went through this breakup. Now, I'm going to pause here for a moment, because it's important to know that there was zero support for women. They didn't get paid the same as men. They were not able to support the family if they were on their own. You had to have a male to earn enough money to keep your family alive, basically. The types of jobs women could do were very limited and didn't pay much money. So if you are a single woman with a few children, most people did have more than 2, then you're going to find it very difficult to support your family on your own. And like many people, Polly and her children ended up going to the casual ward in the workhouse. So the casual ward is basically when you can kind of come in and out of the workhouse, come in and out and stay there, have a couple of meals, but you're not kind of committed to, let's say, months in the workhouse. Okay? And this is where it goes very wrong for Polly. So she's in the workhouse, and then going in and out, she ends up sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square when the riots are happening. Remember the Fenians? And the Irish people were protesting in Trafalgar Square. There was a bomb set off. There she was sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square. And it was only after that that she came to Whitechapel. And then because of her alcoholism, because of things like that, she ended up sleeping rough on the street, and that is where she unfortunately met her end and encountered Jack the Ripper. So you'll see a pattern with these stories. They start off very well educated, some are even sort of middle class, and then it slowly goes down because basically of the treatment of women, because there was no support for women in Victorian times. So our second one, Annie Chapman. So again, she was lower middle class. She was mainly brought up between Knightsbridge and Windsor, so they're very nice areas of London. She was also an alcoholic. Her father was an alcoholic. This may have been passed on. It's, just maybe it was unfortunate that they both were. She ended up marrying a coachman. So to be a coachman was actually a very respectable job. It's not like being a bus driver these days. It was very like a chauffeur, basically. So he would drive around important people in Victorian London. And she was actually one of the very first people to go to rehab. So the new idea that you could cure somebody of alcoholism or addiction. And she went to rehab. unfortunately this failed and she ended up moving back home to live with her parents. Her whole family relationship broke down, and then again she was kind of between homes, out on the streets, where she met Jack the Ripper. Okay, pretty similar story. Our third one is a little bit different. So, let me check her name again. Elizabeth Stride. So she was brought up in Sweden, and in Sweden she was confirmed to be a prostitute. So she was one of the ones who was a prostitute. And at that time in Sweden, if you were kind of known to be a prostitute, you were put on a list and people would kind of be wary of you, be finding it very hard to get a normal job. So you can understand how you wouldn't be able to get a job, you would have to continue being a prostitute. However, at this time she was also unmarried and pregnant, and she also contracted syphilis. So you can imagine the kind of treatment they would use for treating sexually transmitted diseases in Victorian times. They would put like terrible cures which did absolutely nothing, or well, it did more harm than anything. So you can imagine what going through that must have been awful. And then she came to London with when she got married, and she worked as a servant, and she also ran a little coffee shop with her husband, which is interesting. However, then there was bad financial crisis, as we know about from what it's like to live in Whitechapel, and their business went under. And again, she was going in and out of the casual ward in the workhouse and continuing to work as a prostitute, and it was then that she met Jack the Ripper. So our fourth one, Catherine Eddowes. Now, Catherine was brought up in the Midlands near Wolverhampton, kind of near Birmingham, and then she came to London and worked in the tin factories, and she was very interesting actually. She married a man, and what they did is sort of like his hobby, but also he made money from it as well. They would write ballads. Now basically it's like when there was a hanging, because you could watch hangings in those days, and so when there was a hanging she would go and write a little poem or write a little song about the story of these people being killed and then sell it at the gates. Like that was a genuine job that people would do. So they used to write ballads together, sell them in pubs, things like that, which is pretty interesting. And again, really, really similar story. Her husband was abusive, she turned to alcoholism, they ended up breaking up, in and out of the workhouse, in and out of the streets, and met her end with Jack the Ripper. Now our final victim of Jack the Ripper is Mary Jane Kelly. And she is probably the one of the most mysterious. She was beautiful, she was only 25 when she was killed, so she was young, she had a lot going for her. However, nobody knew really where she had come from. She had lived sort of different lives, she changed her name a few times. Mary Jane Kelly was not her real name. We don't know what her real name was. She'd come possibly from Ireland, possibly from other places in Europe. Didn't really know. But she is interesting because she was the only one to be found inside a house, and supposedly Jack the Ripper had broken a window to get inside the house. Everyone else had been killed whilst they'd been possibly sleeping rough on the street. So that's just a little bit all about the victims. But what I really want us to think about is, don't just assume they're prostitutes, because they were all pretty well educated. They all had quite a lot going for them, but because of difficult circumstances, they've been through a breakup or they've lost their jobs, their husbands have lost their jobs, and because work for women was hard to get, was underpaid, and there was no support for single women. Even if you didn't have a breakup, what if your husband died? People died of curable diseases these days all the time, but they weren't curable then. People died easily. Now, there was absolutely nothing in place. The charity was the workhouse, and we knew that nobody wanted to go to the workhouse. You had to be desperate to go to the workhouse. So let's bear that in mind, because I think we also need to, I don't know, sort of do justice to the women that died, because clearly Jack the Ripper was an awful person. We spent ages in history trying to find out who he was, all these things about him, but actually, don't we owe it to the women that died to know more about them? So bear that in mind when we do this little bit of work. And next video is on how the police tried to catch Jack the Ripper, which is very interesting.